Ever feel like you're just racing against the clock?
Yeah.
Like every single second counts, you know?
Totally.
That's what we're diving into today. How different cultures actually, like, view time itself.
Yeah.
We've got this text. It's really got me thinking.
Oh, yeah.
It's almost spiritual, honestly, but it lays out these two totally contrasting ways to think about time.
Interesting.
It doesn't even say, like, where it's from originally, but I don't know. Got me hooked.
Well, it's such a fundamental concept, isn't it? I mean, time, we think we know it, but then to think that there are completely different ways of even perceiving it.
Exactly. So the first one, this linear time, it's that whole time is money thing, right? Like every second counts. You can make the most of it. And the text brings up this term I'd never even heard of, eschatology.
Yeah, eschatology.
There is
It's essentially that focus on the end game, right? The ultimate goal.
Yeah.
Where we're all working towards, future-oriented.
Okay, so it's like always looking ahead.
Always striving. Reaching for that next milestone. And, this really resonates with how a lot of Western societies function, doesn't it? That constant need for progress, for achievement.
Yeah, and this whole consumerism thing.
Yeah.
Like you always need the next best thing.
Exactly. Always needing to do more, acquire more.
It's like always being on,
That always-on mentality.
Yeah, and I feel like so many people listening right now are probably like nodding their heads like, yep, that's me.
Absolutely.
But here's the thing. Then the text goes in a totally different direction.
Yeah.
It introduces this idea of spatial time.
Okay.
It gets all poetic here. It even quotes Ecclesiastes.
Woo!
Talking about them like it's these seasons. Each one has its own purpose, its own rhythm.
It is beautiful imagery when you think about it that way. Instead of time being this straight line that we're racing along, it's more like a rich tapestry. All these different times woven together, creating unique spaces for specific experiences.
Actions.
So instead of asking what's next,
Right.
it's more about what fits now.
Yeah.
Is this the right time for this?
It's that feeling of there's a season for everything. There's a time to plant, a time to harvest.
Oh, I like that.
And if you try to rush one or the other, you end up disrupting that natural order.
It throws a whole system off balance.
Precisely. And you can really see how different this is from that linear perspective. This view emphasizes being present, being connected to the natural rhythms of life, finding that harmony.
Okay, so we've got these two very different ways of looking at time, and now the text is like, okay, choose.
But it doesn't just leave us hanging with these two options.
Yeah.
It's like it wants us to figure out how to make them both work.
Or at least to make a conscious choice about which perspective we're going to embrace.
Yeah, and it gets even deeper than that. Because then it throws in this whole thing about you can't serve two masters.
Oh.
Right. And the text specifically connects this to serving mammon.
Mammon, material wealth, greed.
Exactly. Like, are we so caught up in the pursuit of more that we become slaves to the clock?
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Is this always-on mentality really serving us, or is it serving something outside of ourselves?
Right. So if we know these two different perspectives exist, how do we even choose? Or how do we even begin to find some sort of balance?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is.
I think it's important to acknowledge that both perspectives have their own merits and their own potential downsides, too.
Right, like clinging too tightly to that linear view that can lead to burnout.
Absolutely. But on the other hand, being too lax about spatial time might lead to stagnation. So it's really about finding that sweet spot, being intentional with our actions, making conscious choices without letting the clock completely dictate our lives.
So it's more about understanding how these different perceptions of time color our choices.
Exactly.
For example, how might viewing time as this abundant tapestry instead of just a limited resource, how might that change how you go after your own goals?
It's fascinating because these two views of time, they're not just abstract concepts. They reflect these deeply ingrained cultural and philosophical differences.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Well, for instance, Eastern philosophies. They often emphasize cyclical patterns of time, right? Everything's connected, everything's flowing.
And that's more in line with the spatial view.
Exactly. And then you look at many indigenous cultures, they have this deep connection to the cycles of nature, the seasons, which again aligns more with that spatial perspective.
Like asking yourself, am I chasing after the future, or am I present in this moment?
Right.
I'm curious to hear from you listening. Which view resonates with you more? Do you find yourself drawn to one over the other?
Imagine approaching your dreams not as these items on a to-do list, bound by deadlines, linear time, but instead as seeds you've planted in that rich soil of spatial time. They're meant to blossom in their own time,
Wow.
in their own season.
That is such a powerful image. I love that. This whole conversation has honestly made me rethink my own relationship with time. It's not just about what we do with our time, it's also about how we see it.
Absolutely.
And that's something I think we could all benefit from reflecting on. And who knows, maybe we'll even explore some practical applications of these ideas in our next deep dive.
Sounds like a plan.
But until then, keep diving deep.